I am certainly on record for rooting for one conference championship game above all others, that we see those two schools play in the final Pac-12 championship game. I think that's for obvious reasons. Yes, the plight of Washington State, the plight of Oregon State still hanging in the balance, but much is going on and much to catch up on concerning the two schools that played on the football field a couple weeks ago and are having fine football seasons, and certainly showed their solidarity during that game and during this entire process. So we are going to size up Oregon State and Washington State, the entire issue with the litigation and everything that's going on right now. We got Tony Altimore right next to me, consultant and strategist. We appreciate Tony, of course, helping us with such things here at the Voice of College Football. And Tony Siracusa, last word on college football, and distinguished member of the Football Writers Association, and on just about every possible board that votes for the various postseason award winners across college football. Gentlemen, you're the two that I call on. Thank you so much for answering the call.
Glad to do it. Tony, good to see you, my friend.
All right, folks, comments and questions are always welcome. We appreciate those. They will be highlighted, of course, by Super Chats. We will get to those for sure, so we appreciate your contributions. So just about 6 weeks ago, the Mountain West Conference made its presentation to both Washington State and Oregon State. We also know that the American Conference has basically said, and I'm not understanding of this based on their mission to join the Power Four or Power Five, and them touting themselves as the sixth of the Power Five here in the last decade, that they would say, hey, we're not going westward. That's not going to happen. Stanford and Cal, of course, they are moving on to the ACC. Oregon State and Washington State, apparently, it doesn't appear, based on everything that I'm reading, that they are targeted or ticketed for either the ACC or the Big 12. So that doesn't appear likely. And then we have this restraining order that was granted to the two schools against the Pac-12 to give them power and decision-making authority, that was countered by a Washington-led litigation and motion filed against them. We also have Pac-12 media rights that I didn't know until this afternoon. This is the one thing I did learn, that actually extend with Fox and ESPN into the 2024-25 sports season. So I got to think that there's something there. And I'm guessing and seeing, putting things together, that there's been kind of currently an assessment by the powers that be of what the resources and the liabilities are in play right now, to get a gauge on what's worth what. We will start there. So Tony Altimore, you take it from here in regards to the latest and what the impact is probable to be.
Well, the big latest that I think is probably the most significant is that they have brought in a mediator who is, according to my lawyer friends, one of the most respected mediators in the country, former federal judge who has a special mediation practice in Southern California. Funny enough, I told Mark, also apparently the father of Ariana Grande's high school boyfriend. Yes. So one of those, only in the Pac-12 is your mediator. Is that your mediator?
But Tony, if we brought you on for anything else, you've served your purpose.
But apparently he is one of the most respected mediators in the country. A friend of mine who's a lawyer who's worked with him a bunch of times said everyone will leave a little bit pissed and yet satisfied. So I think that that's probably the answer. One of the weirdest things, and Tony has lots of legal stuff, so I don't want to step on his toes, but one of the things that I thought was really interesting, there were a lot of problems with the argument that Washington State and Oregon State made in the initial argument, and the Pac-12 didn't bring up any of them. They had a very good lawyer that came actually a Cal grad, because in the Pac-12 you cannibalize yourselves in everything. CalGrad was the attorney on behalf of Washington State, Oregon State, made their case. And then the Pac-12 chose to make no logical arguments about standing, no questions about irreparable harm. I mean, there's all these very fundamental legal problems with the case they brought. The Pac had one guy in a very wrinkled suit, and when you can see how wrinkled it is on YouTube, you know it's not good. And they didn't make any of the arguments. They got the temporary restraining order. The judge is the recent or past president of the Cougar Club of Whitman County, which is like if you were the president of the Buckeye Club of Columbus. I mean, it's unreal that that's who got this. But again, the PAC didn't make any good arguments. So Washington has now stepped in. They filed a whole bunch of paperwork and motions to step in sort of on their behalf. And then the other 9 schools, because they're not Washington residents, the other 9 schools have sent a brief supporting that. It makes a whole lot of sense. This really comes down to a fundamental issue, and Tony will go more into this, but really a fundamental issue in the PAC bylaws are fairly poorly written, but the intention of them is clear: to keep teams in through August 1st, 2024, when the media rights expire. And there's all sorts of stuff about how you can get injunctions to stop teams from leaving before then, blah, blah, blah. Some bad wording around the phrase notice. So the question is it notice of the withdrawal, or is it notice of the withdrawal? What's the most important part? Logic points out it's the withdrawal because, and in fact, they said something like, under Washington State and Oregon State's interpretation, you could leave as long as you keep it a secret until the day before. And that's, clearly ridiculous. But at the same time, a little calmer heads need to prevail. Again, lots of legal arguments that I'll defer to the more gurus on, but probably this case should never be where it is.
Tony.
Yeah, I think, look, it probably helps to kind of walk through some of the steps that got us here a little bit, because Oregon State and Washington State filed a lawsuit, and it was literally to stop the governance or the participation in conference governance from the remaining schools. Because as Tony Altamore pointed out, when you give notice that you're leaving, you are inherently supposed to be stripped of your voting rights. And therefore, you have no say in anything that goes on anymore. The remaining schools have done that theoretically. Part of the question, which we'll get to in a minute, is how did they do it? Because they are saying, well, we never really gave notice. But there's the argument, hey, you've been all over social media saying with your official Twitter feeds, hey, we can't wait to join the new Big 12 and we're excited to go to the ACC. So you've given notice. Maybe not saying, dear Pac-12, we are leaving, but you've given notice. Look, they filed the lawsuit to stop the other schools from participating in the governance and the voting. They went to go get an injunction because the schools were going to have a meeting via Zoom where they were going to discuss how to divide up the 2023-24 revenue that gets allocated to all schools throughout the conference. The TV revenue, the postseason revenue in all sports. And the schools who are leaving wanted to have a vote, and clearly just based on numbers, they would have outvoted Washington State and Oregon State. They wanted to vote to use that money to help their transition out of the conference to the other conferences. Washington State and Oregon State had the argument that said, hang on a second, you don't get a vote because you're leaving. They were granted the injunction, temporary injunction, that stopped that meeting from ever happening. Now, there are court dates coming up in November. As Tony pointed out, there is now also an arbitration hearing, which is significant. In the meantime, University of Washington filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit. part of it was their claim that the school's not actually leaving until August 1st officially, that they're entitled to the full rights up to that point, bearing in mind that this money is always allocated somewhere around end of June. And so therefore they're entitled to their full rights up until the day they leave. They're entitled to their money. They're entitled to everything. They also claimed, in a really flimsy argument, that conference membership is voluntary. And so therefore, as long as they stay within the loose bounds of their contract, which really is guided by the grant of rights, because once the TV deal is up, basically you're free of your contract and you're free to go, that Oregon State and Washington State really have no argument in this lawsuit, as long as everybody does what they're supposed to do up to August 21st. Now, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. As soon as they announced they were leaving, UCLA and USC were stripped of their voting rights by all of these schools, including Washington and Oregon. The schools who are fighting Washington State and Oregon State voted to strip UCLA and USC of their voting rights. To an even larger step, they took Martin Jarman, the UCLA athletic director, off of the NCAA committee. He was on the basketball selection committee for the tournament. They had him removed, saying you were there to represent the Pac-12 and you no longer will be a part of the Pac-12. You've announced, you have given notice that you're leaving. They had him taken off of the committee for last year's tournament. So there are some steps that these other schools did, which Oregon State and Washington State are now saying, hang on a second, you did the exact same thing we're looking to do to you. Yesterday, George Kliavkoff, apparently from his vacation home in Montana, gave a sworn statement that verified that UCLA and USC were already without their voting rights, that within 30 days of them announcing, which was a little over a year and a half ago, or right around then, June of last year, that the conference voted to remove them from any voting decisions, any panel decisions. That actually goes to help Oregon State and Washington State's argument, because it says that there is a precedent that this has been done, and now we're looking to do it furthermore. And Kliavkoff, by the way, literally, when I joke that he did it from his mountain home, his vacation, I'm actually being serious. This week was Pac-12 men's basketball and women's basketball media days. Kliavkoff, the commissioner of the conference, was not there. He's got nothing to say. He's got nothing to add. He didn't want to answer any questions or do the media session. So he stayed at his vacation home in Montana, didn't even show up for any of the conference events. So that is where we are right now. There is arbitration being scheduled. I agree with Tony's assessment. I think that is ultimately probably the end product of all of this. I don't think the lawsuit goes, sees its opening days in mid to late November with a lawsuit that generally goes, as most lawsuits do, would stretch well over a year. I don't see that as being the end result. I see some sort of nobody's happy and everybody's upset arbitration agreement, because it's the fastest resolution. You really don't have a year to get this resolved. You really don't. Especially when Oregon State and Washington State don't have a future home yet, and they need to be free of any litigation and entanglements in order to be able to merge with someone else or move to another conference. So I think the arbitration is the end deal. But if you look at what Oregon State and Washington State ultimately have at stake, if they're basically looking to run the conference. we're the only two schools still in proper standing. We will determine the future of the Two-Pac, or whatever we're going to call it. And they would split all the revenues between the two of them. There would be no allocation to all the other schools. So that 35 million per school, or whatever it winds up being in the current academic year, would all go to those two schools instead. There's going to be some sort of compromise to get everybody out of it, but that kind of walks up the courthouse steps, if you will, to get you where you are now.
Well, and one thing I thought was helpful that the judge did put in the temporary restraint was that they cannot meet as a whole board. However, they can govern the conference and do things by unanimous agreement.
Correct.
So, and it was funny. I think he said it was something like that's how he handled. He actually, I mean, again, super shady that the judge is the president of the Cougar Club of Whitman County. But actually, if you read the things that he wrote, they're pretty well reasonable. And he said something like, "This is what we do in divorces.
Yeah,
Is as long as you all agree unanimously in writing, you can continue to do things." And so that prevents them from doing things like, I don't know, having a garage sale for the office equipment, while handing out of all the revenues just to the two.
Yeah, it means they can't have a Zoom meeting, is really what it means. But there can be an issue before them, and Oregon State, or bad example, Stanford emails in their vote, and Arizona State emails in their vote, and everybody operates independently like that, but you still wind up with the same thing. But he was specific in that they may not make decisions as to the allocation and division of any revenue yet. That is going to be part of the further proceedings. So their plan to say, hey, we're all going to get 30 million to help pay the movers to go to the Big Ten or go to the Big, that's not happening, not anytime soon. So the a last word on college football, we have learned to adore the conference name, the Two-Pac, and that's that's where we are right now. So, but I agree with Tony. Ultimately, this winds up with months of arbitration, probably settling it sometime before the end of the year. Again, Oregon State and Washington State need to be out from these entanglements so that they can move forward. No conference wants them while they're still under litigation with tens of millions of dollars at stake.
Well, and also, and I can't promise this, but I've been told by a couple people that USC is about as uninvolved in this as possible. And it is everyone else that is fighting, and just no pointing fingers at the Trojans, who are apparently just very hands off.
Yeah, I've talked to people in the UCLA. I've talked to people in the UCLA administration, and they're like, Martin Jarman gets his notices and notifications, and they go in the file, and really he won't speak on it. I'm sure he has opinions on it, but UCLA and USC have, for all intents and purposes, been removed from the process for a year already anyway. So they're kind of like, you guys are going to figure it out. We'll vote on whatever it is we need to vote on. But beyond that, our name's Bennett and we ain't in it.
Well, and there are some other interesting precedents too. So, for example, with Oklahoma and Texas, and a lot of people have told me that technically, depending on how you want to argue it, that USC and UCLA were they kicked off, or have they sort of acquiesced to being recused of future endeavors? Because the only thing that the presidents have dealt with in the past year is media rights and expansion.
Right.
And USC and UCLA continue to vote, as particularly on the athletic director level, on the things operating for the conference this year.
Right.
So if you look at like what Texas and Oklahoma, by the way, were in exactly the same boat. And one of the things, and this is where I knew that we were really dealing with like not high caliber attorneys on this thing, is that when Washington State and Oregon State first even filed their thing, they talked about the Pac-12 as being 110 years old. When we're talking about the legal structure, the Pac-12 was founded in 1959.
Right.
The Pacific Coast Conference has no legal relationship to the Pac-12. Literally, it was. I mean, that's like saying that the U.S. is part of the United Kingdom. No, we took care of that.
Right.
And so there's lots of like really like poorly handled stuff in these frantic motions where if you actually look at it, you're like, well, that doesn't really work. But even if you do want to pretend it works, there is some still precedent in how they handled when USC and UCLA left the conference last time in 1958.
Right. And to that same point, when I read the University of Washington's motion to dismiss, and I read through it, and look, I'm no lawyer. I just play one in court when I get in trouble. I read it and I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Conference membership is voluntary. Well, sure, up until the moment you sign a binding contract, you can't just willy-nilly come and go from one year to the next. I mean, because there were a lot of ways that they could have put that, but to call it voluntary was really just a poor choice of words, because it really does not reflect the spirit of the agreement in this conference, or frankly, in any conference.
There is some really interesting debates though, and I not being a member of the Washington bar, I can't attest to what precedents and decisions that they have. There are a lot of interesting arguments about really whether this court even has the jurisdiction to do this.
Right.
Like, and they're really, really good arguments about that, let alone all of the, governmental entity, there's just a lot of legal issues in this, which is why I think that it will end up in arbitration sorted out. Because again,
Agreed.
it's just, they don't have years to figure this stuff out.
Agreed.
So Tony outlined, of course, you're both Tony, but Tony Siracusa outlined a compelling case as to why obviously Washington State and Oregon State want to keep the PAC conference together, the Two-Pac, together in the interim because of the financial, and the ultimate for them would be to work it out to where they're splitting the entire distribution, but it's more feasible and reasonable that they will not get that, but that they'll be able to work something out to their favor. But long term, I believe Oregon State's on record, their athletic director is saying, this is our number one intent long term, is to keep this conference together. And that seems rather obvious why that would be a better move for Oregon State and Washington State than necessarily moving to the Big 12 or the ACC or any other conference, the Mountain West certainly, because the branding stays consistent. Their original members, I don't know if they are original members, but they would be original members of, the new iteration of the PAC conference. And it would just make total sense. They could pretty much make the invitations and structure it in such a way in which they have leverage and they have, that founding status. So how feasible do you think it is that they're going to be able to almost be the founders of a new conference in a sense?
They have a problem. There's no TV deal and no interest from anyone. So what do you use as the pull to get other schools to join you? Other schools en masse. I mean, you need a large number of schools. Well, okay, let me back up the train on that for a second also, because here's a really weird, and I see Tony Altomare laughing. I think he knows where I'm going with this. There is a very, very buried in the fine print of NCAA membership where you are required to have 8 schools in your conference to be a recognized conference, right? However, and this is a big however, if you have schools that leave your conference and basically you're what's left, whether it's 2 or 4 or 6, you have 2 years to rebuild the conference back up to 8. The Two-Pac could stay the Two-Pac for 2 years. Now, that's funny and it's legitimate. It's not logistically feasible because you would play each other and then you got to go find, 11 out of conference games somewhere else for football and do a whole basketball schedule some other way. So legally, you could do it. Logistically, there's no way it really works.
And the funny thing, though, by the way, is that's how Washington State got into this conference.
Yes.
So in the 1950s, when they created the Pac-12, opened the doors in 1959, they only had 5 members. It was called the Big Five. It was originally the Big Four, and then they added Stanford. It was the Big Five. And the NCAA finally cracked down on them and said, you have to have more members. Right. And I mean, UCLA would have burned down the Pacific Northwest schools in the 1950s. The UCLA announced a severing of relations like it was North Korea closing embassies. They were so mad in the 1950s about this. And so to get up to that number and also to make Washington a little happy because it was a long train ride from Seattle to San Francisco, they added Washington State and they got up to 6, which at the time was the minimum, and then later added the 2 Oregons. So it's kind of funny that clause that got them into the conference may be the one that gives them the conference in the end.
Could be. But look, let's say that there's a merge in one direction or the other with the Mountain West. And I don't mean any disrespect to any Mountain West fans who are out there watching us. It's not like there's a lot of booming TV markets in the Mountain West either, but at least the Mountain West has a TV deal. They would bring that to the table with the Two-Pac because, look, Fox, ESPN, YouTube TV, Apple TV, no one's lining up waiting to sign Pullman and Corvallis to a new TV deal. They almost have to inherit or absorb part of, what someone else is already a part of in order to make this work. So could they convince all of the Mountain West schools to leave and become part of the, 14-pack or whatever the number winds up being? Maybe, that's fine. But it would have to be all of them, because if it's only some of them, those ones that are leaving would have to do a buyout of their contract with the Mountain West, and the TV deal for the Two-Pac isn't going to be significant enough to make it worth their while. So it would have to be the entire conference coming over, or those 2 schools moving all the way over to the Mountain West. It's got to be a complete immersion. It can't be partial.
Well, and my impression, and Tony, you know this probably better than I do, but my impression was that was the math that the American Conference did in choosing not to pursue them, was that the additional travel cost was so much higher than the additional marginal revenue that they would have to start, sending volleyball teams from, East Carolina and Temple to Pullman was just, it wasn't that didn't make sense for an extra couple $100,000 of TV money at best for the
100% correct. Yeah, 100% correct. So they've got to, and that's again why it's got to be everybody in the Mountain West, or it doesn't work, because having to do the buyout of your conference contract with the Mountain West in order to take what is really going to be a minimal TV deal to join the Two-Pac isn't financially viable, even though the travel, as Tony was talking about with the AAC, even though the travel is going to be a lot closer, regionally speaking, still it is cumbersome without the money. And Oregon State, really, frankly, needs the resolution in court, in arbitration, and in their future, because without it, long term, they don't have the money to pay Jonathan Smith's new contract extension. It's the biggest contract the Beavers have ever paid anyone to be football coach, and that money starts getting really tight if you don't have some sort of security blanket.
Well, about 40 to 50%, depending on the math you use, but about call it 40% most optimistically. 40% of their budget for the Oregon State and Washington State athletic departments comes from the PAC revenue, which is
Right.
about 40 million.
Correct.
So if that 40 million becomes Mountain West, what is the Mountain West now? 7. You know, yeah, and you get some extra basketball money now. Let's call it 10. You got a $30 million delta that those schools can't afford. And those schools, by the way, are already subsidizing their athletic departments pretty heavily on the academic side anyway.
Right.
So it's going to be a budget crisis. I mean, they're running $90-some million athletic departments. G5 schools are usually $30 to $50 million athletic departments.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that whole travel situation was one reason why I thought there might be an ACC Pac-12 merger, because the travel on the surface would seem to be too cumbersome and too much of a weight. But you could almost treat the two as two separate conferences to a certain extent, have very few crossover games, and then you just meet in the middle as a conference championship. But obviously that got away from the Pac-12 at some point along the line with all the defections to
Like
the Big 12 and the Big 10.
Well, yeah. As conferences, when the conferences were still, or when the Pac-12 was still whole, there was some logic there, and you can split the TV, and it would have given the ACC a security blanket that it desperately needs, because Jim Phillips wakes up every day concerned about the status of Florida State, Clemson, Virginia, North Carolina, Miami to a lesser degree, and their activity in trying to get out of the grant of rights. You know, I know we're talking West Coast, but that grant of rights for the ACC goes to 2036. There is, you and I have had this conversation before, Mark, and so I don't worry about going on record. There is zero chance the ACC is in its current formation to 2036. There is zero chance we see the last days of that grant of rights in its current formation. Zero.
When you look at the TV ratings, zero. We're on record, and we've already been on record, everyone. 0%. Tony just said it. When we look at the TV ratings, and Tony Altimore, of course, we're still going to circle the calendar at some point to do our
Whenever
TV
you're ready.
ratings. Yeah, absolutely. I can't wait to do that. When you look at the TV ratings, and now this, collectively, I can't think of another time in which these two football programs have been in a better place, again, collectively, than they are right now. The TV ratings for these two schools aren't bad. They're not going to blow anyone away, but they're certainly competitive with the rest of the lower half of the conference and competitive with most of the teams in the Big 12. I don't know if when they really grind down to the granular what they're looking for in where that TV rating is coming from, that they want those markets more so than just this dispersed audience that they may be deeming somewhat attached to Pac-12 membership and Pac-12 pull. So once you pluck Washington State and Oregon State out of the Pac-12, a projection that they won't draw those kind of numbers.
Well, Washington State draws fourth best in the pack or something traditionally. People watch Washington State, and actually a great analogy to Washington State is Texas Tech. Washington State is the state school, the state ag school. It just happens to be 4.5 hours from civilization, versus much like Lubbock. But the people of Washington State and the fans of Washington State are in the big city. They're in Seattle and Olympia and Tacoma. So the people watch Washington State, but it is a haul to get to. It's very similar to Texas Tech, where all the fans are in Dallas, but the school is in Lubbock.
Yeah, going to Washington State, when the quickest way to get there, if you're going from Southern California, the quickest way to get there is to fly into Boise, Idaho, and then get a rental car to go over. You're like, wow, this is no normal road trip, right?
The airport is so small, they didn't even know how to handle USC's plane last time, and they tipped it over. It did a wheelie. butt into the ground of the plane.
So here's the thing, though, with regards to the ratings. Historically, Tony, of course, is right that Washington State does well. They're doing, but to your point, Mark, they're doing particularly well right now, as is Oregon State. But it's they have to look to see if it's a 1-year anomaly. Look, Oregon State's a really good team right now. And you and I talked about this before the season even started when I said DJ Uiagalelei was going to go to Oregon State and have a better year than anything he had at Clemson, because Jonathan Smith was a good enough coach to build the offense around him instead of trying to shove him into their offense. Cam Ward is having a terrific season at Washington State. But in order to make a viable media investment, you need that 4 or 5 year trend line in order to make a real commitment. You can't just look and say, hey, they're having a really good year, let's jump on it, while they're hot, because next year they may not be.
Yeah, we're not talking about known commodities. This is
Right.
not Oklahoma or Ohio State, where we've got about 98% certainty that they're going to be who they are right now
Right.
for decades.
And the sad thing too is if you look back, so right before they joined the pack, Oregon State won a Heisman Trophy in 61 or something, I think. And then until Denny Erickson showed up, they were one of the worst teams in football. And then Mike Riley had some spurts, and then they plunged back down again. And now Jonathan Smith, who I guess went in with his Denny Erickson ring to his interview, brought them back up. And
so you're saying Craig Fertig was not the be all end all for Oregon State, right?
He was not. And look at Washington State. I mean, Washington State had there was they had like a Rose Bowl and I don't know, before the Depression.
Yeah, 2002.
But before the Depression, and then they had nothing until 97.
97, 02. Yeah.
97 and 02. And so, you don't have the same sort of history. They're kind of like Baylor in that they've had some recent success that's awesome. But you worry, is it sustainable? And especially, is it sustainable at a 40% drop in revenue?
Right.
I'm not going to split hairs on the TV deals, but I came up with these numbers today: $4 million per school for the Mountain West and $7 million for the American. So regardless, it's just too much of a plunge to take from 35 million to those kind of numbers. So,
but what's their choice?
What's their choice exactly?
They've been left out. The musical chairs. Realignment isn't over long term. There is going to be more merging of conferences, and the Big Ten will become so big that we wind up going back to life as it was before. We wind up with a West Division and an East Division, and the Western schools are actually out there playing other Westerns. It's going to wind up looking amazingly similar to what it looked like for the last 50 years. But we're 5 to 6 years away from that. So
if only there was a place that could play that game between those two divisions,
right?
Maybe at 2 p.m. Pacific on January 1st.
Exactly. In the here and now, the musical chairs have stopped, and these two schools are left standing up. They don't have a lot of other options, and you got to be concerned if you're Washington State, with the school president having already frozen all, during the summer, froze all, unnecessary discretionary spending, budget woes, all of these things. And I get it. He said those things and he did those things because in the state of Washington, the school has to show a balanced budget. So there was a rhyme and reason to it that was only partially money and partially just logistical tap dancing. I get that, but they're already somewhere down that path, at least partially. And so again, you need the deal. You're going to go to arbitration. You're going to take whatever the arbitrator gives you because it's better than the money you're going to spend litigating for the next year with no promise of a victory at the end, you may only wind up with, you may just wind up with your 35 million, which you're entitled to, and the other schools are going to get theirs, or some combination thereof, that you'll wind up close. And you're going to take, if you're Oregon State and Washington State, you're going to take it because your next TV deal is going to be much smaller.
Well, and there's other questions. One of the other big things that they really want, which is sort of an issue, is as we've talked about on the channel before, related to some of the other conferences, the basketball money that was earned by UCLA and Arizona and everybody like that is on a 6-year cycle.
Mm-hmm.
So it would keep coming in, and if there were only 2 of them, they could pocket it. There's
Mm-hmm.
also some question, and I haven't seen the contracts, and so I don't want to get into the details of the CFP contract. There are a lot of people who question whether or not what the CFP's deal is with the PAC, whether maybe for the next 2 years they might be able to continue pocketing a large sum of money from the CFP. It seems to me like CFP sort of operates a little thuggish, and so it wouldn't surprise me if that went away.
I actually think, because part of what's happening with the CFP now is they are having to have discussions as to how to reformulate the playoffs starting next year, because you're not going to have a 2-team conference and the champion of that conference get an automatic playoff bid. And part of that is that they're going to figure out how to try to help, for lack of a better word, save Oregon State and Washington State. In other words, if there's still some sense of revenue that we can kind of push their way a little bit to help ease them in. And ironically enough, it has actually been, from what I've been told and people we've talked to, it is actually, when you say they operate in a thuggish manner, it's actually Greg Sankey who has been pushing let's see what we can do to, maybe there's a way to help them financially ease into whatever is next for them.
So it sounds like both of you have the PAC 2, or the Two-Pac, my apologies, the Two-Pac ticketed for the Mountain West.
I don't see another
easiest. It's the most expeditious, where you could get it done sooner than you can other deals with other conferences.
Well, and the other thing too, and Mark, we've done lots of stuff where we talk about fit. Like, those schools fit well. The Mountain West schools are generally state, small Western state flagships and small Western state schools. And so, big schools of the smaller states. And the Oregon State, Washington State fit very well in with the Mountain West. Certainly fit better with the Mountain West than they do with Tulane and East Carolina and Memphis and those schools. So they would fit well with them. And it makes sense to me. The other thing I wouldn't be surprised to see, and Tony knows better than I do on this, but it wouldn't surprise me that if they were going to continue as the Two-Pac for a year or two, they could have some kind of alignment agreement scheduling with the Mountain West.
Sure.
That would fill like a bunch of almost kind of like Notre Dame and the ACC, that would give them a contract that gets them on TV. Certainly that would, especially at Mountain West rates, be attractive for them. I think there's something that could be worked out there, and maybe that's part of what comes out of the arbitration. I don't know. But
and from a football standpoint, no, you know what? Let's not limit it to football. From a sports standpoint across the board, those 2 schools would be competitive right away in the Mountain West. It wouldn't be them, pulling up the bottom or anything. They would be immediately competitive to the point of competing for the conference championship. Look, I think
and lots of sports too, because Washington State is second in Directors Cup points. I think isn't Wazoo second worst behind Colorado?
Right. So
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, no, it's okay. But I think you also have to look at, I think one of the things that kind of helps with the Mountain West issue is the Mountain West commissioner, Gloria Nevarez. She is truly one of the better conference commissioners in the country. Very buttoned up. She's got a Pac-12 background. And, I know you and I talked about this back when it happened, Mark, when Kleofkoff, I came on your show the day Kleofkoff was named the commissioner, and I sat there and said, man, they missed out on Navarez. I know she got interviewed for it, and they really missed out on her, because who is this Kleofkoff guy that no one's heard of? And so I think that actually helps. She's Pac-12 friendly, whatever that means. She's a smart businesswoman. She's very buttoned up in terms of taking care of her conference, but also looking at what other potential is out there, and bringing it to the table, as opposed to some of the other conference commissioners who've been like, I got nothing to say until I hear from my schools. When they tell me what's going on, then we'll talk about what's going on. There are one, maybe two of the conference one current major conference commissioner who does that. Navarez brings ideas to the table for her schools. I think it would be a big benefit. I think her role in this could help expedite things.
So it's going to be virtually impossible for Oregon State and Washington State to maintain this type of football presence on the landscape as members of the Mountain West. We are seeing potentially, most likely, the end of them as, I'm not going to call them national powers based on my definition of such. They are not national powers, but they are competitive football programs nationally.
Mm-hmm.
There is a brand element, though, that, because I've done work with like companies and mergers and brandings and stuff, and this doesn't apply to anybody watching this video, because anybody watching this video is immersed enough in college football that they would not necessarily feel this way. But to the majority of the public, the brand of the Pac-12 is still strong, is still very strong enough that if you were to reverse merger the Mountain West in, it, I think, would have a significant better brand. It would be, more likely to have an attachment, again, not to you guys who are in the live chat on the Voice of College Football, but to your Uncle Ned and your grandma who can't find the remote anyway, and they're not really sure who all those teams out west are anyway. And if it was Washington State or Wyoming or Stanford, how are they any different? Again, to those which are the majority of people who watch football, I think that there would be a huge brand advantage to them in the reverse merger, where the Mountain West, again, with Gloria Navarez in charge of the whole thing in the end, comes in and they take the Pac name.
And how's that for the irony? Gloria Navarez would be commissioner of the Pac-12 or Pac-14 or whatever.
And I totally get that. And she would be, based on everything that you guys have told me, and because of our conversations over the last several months, I've become a little bit familiar with her work and am extremely impressed as well. That I get from a branding standpoint, from an optics standpoint, but just from a dollar standpoint, and the great reduction in income, difficulty in maintaining the type of head coach, coaching staff, everything you need to do, recruiting, to stay at the level that they currently stand.
And it would really hurt, I think, a lot of the Olympic sports as well.
Agreed. Yeah.
Tony Siracusa, since we've got you here, and of course,
Sure.
You are covering the ACC and Wake Forest in particular, there was, all of this controversy and all of this talk surrounding ACC, and they did make this mammoth move, bringing in Stanford and Cal, but it's been all quiet on the West. What's that?
And SMU.
SMU, yes. SMU, they don't even have to, put them on the books. Just,
no, they don't.
Let them play
Stanford.
football, and they don't cost us anything. Yeah, sure, you can play. But otherwise, all quiet on the Eastern Front concerning Florida State, Clemson. We heard a little rumble a few weeks ago out of Clemson. There was a lot of talk out there about, man, they are ready to make something happen. Now, I didn't hear a whole lot of substantive details on how that would happen, but where do we stand with these supposed departures?
I would not be misguided or misled by the quiet. Florida State's athletic director, he took a lot of heat for being so vocal. It kind of really, even the schools within the conference that agree with him, which specifically North Carolina, Virginia, Clemson, basically quietly, privately, in whatever nice country club over brandies and cigars they do these things at, basically told him to shut up, because you're being vocal about things is putting a spotlight on an issue that we'd really rather deal with quietly, privately. So I wouldn't be misled by, there's no headlines being made. I think that, look, Jim Phillips went out and and he had been talking to Stanford and Cal and SMU for well over a month, never brought it to a vote because he knew he didn't have the votes to get it passed. And so we're not going to do it. Then North Carolina State flipped, which is a whole interesting dynamic within the state of North Carolina, because
and are they the next AAU school?
Well, it's not even. North Carolina State spends a considerable amount of time trying not to be in the shadow of the University of North Carolina, yet they were following them step for step in the expansion conversation. And then one day they flipped and said, "You know what? We'll approve it." That was the last vote that Phillips needed to get this through.
Well, North Carolina State fan alumni were outraged.
Absolutely.
When the 6 new AAU schools came in, and they were not one of them.
Absolutely.
So there are no two better friends in the world to have if you want to join the AAU than Stanford and Cal.
Look, the issue has always, you got the money, and part of the deciding factor obviously was that ESPN has extra money for the conference if they expand, but it's not proportionate to what everybody is already getting. All right. It's at a much smaller percentage. However, you're getting SMU, which does not want a share of the TV contract for 7 years. Mind-boggling. They are, I know your audience. Look, Mark, I know your audience. These are intelligent sports people. So they know SMU. This is one of the wealthiest schools in the country. Their donor base is staggering. They have a guy whose name escapes me at the moment, who used to be in the oil industry. Now he's an oil investor. And he headed up the group that put $300 million in SMU's pocket, just a starter, walking around money, we'll call it, so that you can live the way you've been living without having to worry about not getting the ACC TV money, right? His response when interviewed about it was, it's a few $100 million. No one's going to lose sleep over it. All right, man. I need to get on, one of those genealogy sites and find how this guy and I are related somehow.
I will say, though, one thing about the SMU donor base is that people are going to get mad at me for saying this. They're a little bit more of the, oh, we're good for it kind of mentality than the check writing mentality. Like the SMU endowment is only like, I don't know, I think it's less than $2 billion.
Yeah, but you know what? But this donor base, this donor base pays cash.
They do, but the school, but what you do have a risk though. Yeah, the school needs to they need to make sure that is a little more locked down than just the, oh, we'll keep it up, because that's the kind of thing where a disruption of people get mad at the athletic director, or there's a problem with the president, or a scandal. SMU doesn't have that money necessarily per se. It's not like Stanford, where Stanford could just burp and buy ESPN and give itself a contract if it were.
Right. Look, and you're right. The difference is this: Stanford, actually, part of the reason Stanford wins the Directors Cup every year is because they field more teams than pretty much anyone else in the country. They have 7 teams that are fully endowed by boosters. Though the expenses for those 7 teams don't even come out of the athletic department budget, right? They're fully endowed. So you're right. That's there in a long-term commitment. The difference being SMU pays cash. They're doing a major renovation project to Gerald Ford Stadium, and no, it's not named after the former president, where they have like a big grass area, general seating, and they're closing all that up, putting in suites and whatever. They didn't even do a fundraising campaign for it. They had 4 people pony up the money in cash. Here it is. Go break ground. Do what you got to do. Done. So that was a big help. Jim Phillips also needed to make sure he had numbers in his conference because, and we're going to go back to this, and we're going to be doing it for another couple years, that grant of rights. I am not saying that it's a lock Florida State's going to do this. It's a lock that Clemson's going to do it. North Carolina probably can't do it, and Virginia can't probably do what I'm about to say. It's the choice of law clause that is going to bite the conference in the rear end because it doesn't exist in the grant of rights. It isn't in there. So what's the choice of law? If you want to sue your credit card company, you have to do it in Delaware because the contract you signed when you got your American Express card says so. There's a choice of law clause. There are also clauses about having to do arbitration, having to agree to mediation, before you do the lawsuit. All of those things are in there. I learned moving from Los Angeles to Charlotte, North Carolina, you want to sue your moving company because they broke a bunch of stuff, and being 4 weeks late, you actually have to sue them in the state of Florida because that's where every moving company is licensed. That clause doesn't exist in the grant of rights. It isn't there. So what happens next? Florida State purposely, and there's a reason I'm choosing Florida State, purposely violates the grant of rights. They start negotiating with ESPN to go to the SEC or go do something else, right? And they violate the grant of rights. And they're violating it on purpose. They are antagonizing the conference to sue them. They get to choose the venue because it's not ordained in the grant of rights. They're going to choose the state of Florida, obviously, to have the lawsuit. You know what's going to happen? Look at the state of Florida. And look what happened with the state of Texas. And Tony's nodding because he knows exactly what I'm talking about. Mike Leach sued Texas Tech for wrongful termination, and the state of Tech, and the case was dismissed, even though he was right, even though he was correct, had every legal matter on his side, because the legislature for the state of Texas passed a law that protected the state schools from breach of contract lawsuits. I promise you, the state of Florida legislature will do that to protect Florida State, to allow them to go get a better TV deal somewhere else. Because as of the new Big Ten deal, Rutgers is making twice as much as Florida State and Clemson and everybody else, as is Maryland. And name the bottom feeder schools. They're making more than the top end schools in the ACC by a lot. So watch that coming in the next year or two, which is another reason why Florida State needed to shut up. Stop talking about it. Let us maneuver behind the scenes.
Clemson, and that's a state government that, absolutely, as the Disney people will tell you, does not hesitate to abuse its own laws.
Nope.
And throw things into the wind. So
absolutely. And I will say though, the state of South Carolina would do it to protect Clemson. The rest of them, maybe not so much, but
the one thing I have been told, being around Florida people and talking to some other folks, is that the smartest thing that Florida State could do, if Florida State wanted to join the SEC tomorrow, would be for the governor to give Disney its seats back on the Reedy Creek Improvement District, which is the multi-billion-dollar entity that manages the real estate of Disney World, that is a nasty, actually totally illegal abuse of power by the state of Florida that is going to find its way through federal courts. But if they just wanted to solve that tomorrow, Florida State could go wherever. ESPN, Disney corporate would be happy to make sure Florida State went wherever it wanted.
I think you're 100% right. Yeah, your Florida contact who told you that, I think that is spot on correct. It also would help appease some of the residents of that area who, once they stripped Disney of their ownership rights in that area, all of a sudden had to start paying their own water bills and electric bills and things like that Disney had been covering for all those years. So I look, that's a very real possibility down the road, because it astonishingly is not covered in the grant of rights.
I am certainly on record in favor of the state of Florida taking any conditions away from Disney that should not have been in place to begin with. However, we won't go into a politics. What's that?
I didn't even think about your tie to it. That's funny. You're right.
No, really, that has nothing to do with it necessarily. But
Mark shows up next week with one of those big governors Florida flags behind him.
I wanted to get back to SMU because I'm curious about this. SMU's desire to get into the ACC, did that have to do with Stanford and Cal prestige and them going along?
No.
Because would they not have wanted to join the Big 12? And would the Big 12 not want SMU during this just grab bag that the Big 12 is doing with anyone that's close that can field a football team?
So the SMU boosters have told me that they wanted the ACC the whole time. This was before the PAC. The PAC was a good backup because the ACC wasn't going to take them. They think that they fit with Wake Forest and Duke and Syracuse. Again, the other former Methodist schools. And the advantage, at least that they told me, that they thought the prestige of Stanford and Cal. So now for them to get the Stanford and Cal and all the ACC stuff, and they get to be a part of the ACC that just sort of fits them better.
Yeah, it's been a long push of wanting to be in a Power 5 conference. And Tony's right. They felt the fit was best in the ACC. They felt that they were more high end than most of the Big 12, certainly financially, look, when I spent that time covering SMU, when the Pac-12 shut down COVID, and I was going back and forth to Dallas, and you look at the campus and you look at the area around campus, and it truly is beautiful. And you can, not to be glib about it, but you can really smell the money as you're walking around that area. And that there was a feeling amongst many of the high-end boosters that they were above being in the Big 12, especially a Big 12 that didn't include Texas and the Texas money. So the ACC was the next logical one. But first and foremost, it was wanting to be part of a Power 5 conference.
Well, and also one of the other things for the Big 12, and this is in the defense of the Big 12. So 2 years ago when the Texas thing came out, looking at metrics and all that, SMU makes all the sense in the world for the Big 12, but kind of the last thing in the world they need is another small private school in North Texas that doesn't own its own media market, really.
Well,
they got 3 of them. They're good.
And Texas Tech, Baylor, TCU didn't want anything to do with yet another Texas school in the conference when it comes to recruiting.
Well,
they
and I was
want nothing to do with that.
Well, and I was also told that Iowa State, Kansas State, Oklahoma State did not want any more center of gravity in the state of Texas for that
Sure.
conference.
Sure. I get that.
Great stuff from Tony Altamore, consultant and strategist, helps us here at the Voice of College Football. You can catch Tony each and every Saturday doing USC post-game hosting chores for us at the Voice of College Football, and popping up from time to time when I need him, of course. And then Tony Siracusa, last word on college football. Please check out Tony's work there, and we appreciate Tony lending his expertise to these matters as well. What's going on there at the Last Word on College Football site?
Man, it is a lot of people, a lot of work. I mean, just, today alone, we put out our weekly Heisman poll. You know how that goes. Every Thursday, we've got our writers, casting their internal ballots, and we've got our Heisman top 5 vote getters internally for the Heisman. So we put that out today. We've already published previews for this weekend on Ohio State, Cincinnati, Clemson, South Carolina, an SEC weekend preview. So we've got, putting out a good 7, 8, 9 articles a day, every day now with this new sizable staff that we put together over the summer.
We have to give our buddy Connor Johnson some time,
Sure.
a dedicated Oregon State guy. So he's saying it's lazy analysis to say that you, meaning I guess the Big 12, couldn't extrapolate out Oregon State program success over a 5-year continuous time period and say we don't add market value. I would say the lazy analysis would not be extrapolating it for 15 or 20 years because the market value is sketchy at best.
I think that's true. I think 5 years is too short of a period. And the TV deals that are done, while the contracts may be 5, 6, 7 years, because there are renewal clauses and other extenuating circumstances built into the contracts, the TV networks don't look at it in a 5-year window. They look at it, what value you've brought to the table over a 10-year period or a 12-year period before they're ready to assign a dollar value to you. And so I think, 5 years is too small. And I think, you have to look at it over a broader period of time.
But at the same time, if we look at the market value of Iowa State, Kansas State, Houston, Central Florida, I mean, you start adding up the teams, the teams not named maybe West Virginia or Texas Tech in that conference, like those teams don't have a lot of value. And so I think one of the hardest things, at least for me, is I look at it and I say, all right, I would take Wazoo and Oregon State over any of the Big 8 leftovers that are still left in that conference any day of the week. But the problem is that to them, they're sort of desperate, I think, for people that add big significant value. How much can they puff up from the fact that at the end of the day, you're talking about Iowa State and Central Florida on ESPN+.
And Tony Siracusa, we've got an ACC question here. And at the time when it was announced that there were 6 other schools aligning themselves with Florida State on the grant of rights matter, we had the conversation and I raised the question to you because the one school that was surprising to me was NC State being on that side of the ledger,
right,
and not necessarily Miami. So Doc is asking whether we know why NC State flipped.
We do. It was am I allowed to say, I don't know, it's your show. Am I allowed to say it was a pissing war?
Let it go. Sure.
Because it's what it was. Bubba Cunningham, the athletic director at UNC, went out talking about how he had done the vote count. He had tallied the votes. He knew how the vote was going, and before the vote was canceled. NC State didn't like being counted in as we're part of UNC and Bubba's vote. And, there's a lot of animosity between the two schools anyway. I was actually on the side of, I wasn't sure why NC State was ever going along with UNC or whether they were just going along with the bigger group, the bigger picture. But they openly did not like UNC publicly touting their their vote whipping that they were doing and how that was coming out. So it literally was a pissing war between the two schools, and NC State was like, you know what, these schools, two of them are going to pay for themselves. Cal is a financial drag on everybody, including the state of California.
True.
But what
True.
the heck, you know, we're getting a free ride with these other two schools for a while. So what the heck?
Tony Altimore,
Yeah.
anything the folks watching need to know about what you're working on?
Well, we'd love to have him join us on Wednesdays for our Pac-12 show, and on Saturdays for some fun talking about USC postgame. We got a big game this week.
And Tony is always active on Twitter.
That game this week.
Lately.
That game this week. Hey, since you're a historian, I'm going to tell you. Do we have a minute, Mark? I don't want to run out of
Go to it.
I was at one of the most famous USC Notre Dame games ever.
Which one?
1974.
Oh, so yesterday,
Anthony Davis with the kickoff return, and USC coming back from a 24-point deficit or whatever it was.
In 55-24.
I was there. I was at the Coliseum with my grandfather.
That's awesome. We actually got the scoop on that game. Our co-host Rick has started a new channel, LBC Trojan. Everybody subscribe when you're done here. And we had a talk with yesterday, and I got to sit in on it because I was excited about it. So he's like, "Oh, you can sit down on it." So we were talking with J.K. McKay, John McKay's son,
sure,
who was the wide receiver, who pointed out, he's like Anthony scored some of those. He's like, some of those were set up by some long passes that I happened to catch.
Yeah. He was one of Pat Hayden's favorite receivers back then.
That's awesome. I'm so jealous you were there.
I met Anthony Davis one time, years later. I lived on, if you know the West Coast, if you know Southern California, you know the area. I actually lived on Catalina Island for a summer.
Awesome.
And
beautiful place.
It was. They were having the Miss Los Angeles County beauty pageant in Avalon that weekend. He was one of the judges. Anthony Davis was. And I talked to him. I told him I'd been at that game. And I said, but I got to tell you, I said, I still don't like you because I'm a Bruin. And he went like this. He said, here's something a Bruin will never have. And he took off his national championship ring and he tossed it to me. And he said, take a look at that because a Bruin's never going to have that. I'm like, wow, that's
funny.
Hurtful. That's hurtful,
that's rough,
man.
But it's funny.
It was. But yeah,
and you said, let me take you to Pauley Pavilion to show you some things you guys aren't going to have either.
It's going to be a good game. Look, one of the keys to the game, knowing him as well as I do, is if Sam Hartman can bounce back. Hartman has, and I called it this a year ago. If everybody remembers what was the movie? The Replacements with Keanu Reeves, right? And he was talking about what he was afraid of, quicksand. Sam Hartman has quicksand games. One mistake leads to another. He starts pressing. He starts pushing too hard. He starts trying to make the hero plays. It happens 1 to 2 times a year. Last year, ironically enough, at Wake Forest, when I was there, it happened at Louisville. He had 3 interceptions and a fumble. Look what happened this last weekend at Louisville. And then he went in and the same thing happened at North Carolina State last year. He has 1 or 2 quicksand games a year. He doesn't have I know this sounds ridiculous, but it's true. He doesn't have the talent at the receiver position at Notre Dame that he had at Wake Forest last year. And so he relies on the tight end so much and things like that. But if he can get mentally right again, it's going to be a very competitive game, especially with Alex Grinch's defense being, what it is, the Grinch who stole defense. But it's, so if Sam can get right,
USC fans are dying about it, by the way.
If Sam has another quicksand game, it's going to get ugly because Caleb will put up just a boatload of yards.
I am surprised Notre Dame's a favorite in that game.
I am too. Yeah.
I think the issue, and we said this on our Pac-12 show, and one of my co-hosts gets very, very upset when I say this, but part of it is for the last 3 weeks, USC has played so badly. You can only have so many bad games before people ask, "Are you just bad?" And the USC has to show on the field that they are as good as people thought they were. And I hope they do. I really hope they do, because it's very possible. But at the same time, the last 3 straight weeks have just been garbage
Flat
performances on defense.
Yeah.
Against some pretty lousy teams.
And to me, Tony, the excuse of, well, the game was in hand, the game was fine, we gave up a bunch of garbage points and yardage.
Triple overtime?
Exactly. That disappeared last week. That disappeared with the Arizona game for sure, even though Arizona State was highly competitive early to mid fourth quarter. Colorado was a different sort in that it was this late surge that pretty much needed a miracle to happen. But Arizona State was competitive into the fourth quarter. But this Arizona game, when you are in the brink of losing at any point, one play is going to do it. Then that excuse goes out the door in my books.
Right. Although I had a tweet go really viral with a bunch of Notre Dame people, because there were a couple of those Arizona plays. USC only had 10 people on defense. So I said, maybe we can just play 10 on 10. And the Notre Dame people like that. The USC people did not.
I've had quite a few viral moments with Notre Dame fans over the last few weeks. They're not real happy with me. All right, great stuff. Folks, if you just joined us, go back and watch the rest of the video. Great discussion here and analysis with Tony Altimore, consultant strategist. And you can catch him on our post game at the USC channel here at the Voice of College Football. And of course, Tony Siracusa, who answered the bat call once again. And here he is, last word on college football. Tonys, we appreciate both of you. Thank you so much for making this happen.
Right on, Mark and Tony.
Good evening. Be well.
And for everybody else, we've got Houston and West Virginia post game over on the West Virginia channel after the Mountaineers and the Cougars wrap up. And of course, we will have all sorts of content delivered here in the next few days, leading up to kickoff noon Eastern time on a Saturday. So we will see you then.